Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys, and today, photo basics. This time around dual gain sensors. What are they? How do they work? And how can I benefit from it? Right after this. Now, I've been playing with a new toy. I've got the Z6 III, and as I was playing around with it, getting ready for some reviews upcoming, there's some subject matter that I wanted to explore because I'm going to relate to a lot of terms. And so I've done this series on photo basics. It's been around dynamic range, how ISO and gain apply to dynamic range, and also, just light gathering and what stops of light are. So I've got some other videos out there. So it's a little bit of a series that I'm doing on just some photo basics. And so I encourage you, I'm going to reference some terms. If you're a brand new photographer, you might want to check out those two other videos. I'll put cards over here so that you can find them. In this one, though, we're going to talk about dual gain sensors because it's something that I think most people should at least know about because you're going to hear the term. The purpose in the way I teach is to give the basics. I try to reinforce a lot of this with visuals. I want to be able, for a beginner or intermediate photographer, I want them to leave this video and understand what a dual gain sensor is. And I am pretty sure I'm going to do that. You let me know down in the comments. By the way, subscribe to the channel. If you're not subscribed to the channel, I've got a lot of playlists over there. So it's not all going to be photo basics. My photo basics are for anybody. You don't have to be a wildlife photographer. It's going to give you a pretty good explanation. And I try to make these simple and easy to understand, easy to digest. These are not advanced courses. So if I was teaching this, I would be the 6th grade math teacher. I would not be the graduate level physics professor. So we're going to do a basic dive around dual gain sensors, and we're going to start talking about what that is. And by the way, in the future, I'll be doing some other videos. So this Z6 III video, I've got it coming out. I'm never going to be the first to the market with reviews. I'm just not. I really try to use them and understand them. So I'll never be the most popular channel out here. I've come to accept that, but I think I found a little niche here where I can give some really good reviews through product usage and use them for a long time and give you some good practical feedback. This is the practical channel, whether you're a wildlife photographer or otherwise. Now let's talk about these dual gain sensors. So let's start with kind of a traditional sensor. So years ago, most cameras had a single gain sensor. And that gain was applied at the base ISO. It was one type of gain. When we increase the exposure, so as we got less light to the sensor, remember only two ways to get light to the sensor, and that's the aperture, the opening of the lens, and the shutter speed, how fast that aperture stays open. Those are the two ways to get light in. Once the amount of light is established, we can then brighten it using the third leg of this triangle, and that's with ISO. That's really where the gain comes in. So if I get enough light in there, I don't need much gain. If I don't get a lot of light in there, I need to turn up that volume knob. I need to crank up the gain. And in this case, it's not volume, but it's a brightening of that image. It's a raising of the luminance. So I'm increasing the exposure by turning that knob. And when I do that, just like sometimes you turn it up too loud, the speakers start to crack, I'll get some noise in there. That noise, by the way, happens because I didn't get light into the sensor. So the ISO reveals the noise. We think often as ISO as getting the image noisier. What it's really doing is amplifying a lack of light. And I'll show you some examples and maybe it'll make sense when I do it in Photoshop and kind of correct some images to show you the actual noise on an image. But traditionally, we applied one type of gain to a sensor. So ISO 100, we said, this is the type of gain that is applied. And all we did is increase the amount of gain. So if we needed a brighter exposure, we put more of that gain. But the type of gain is the same. More of it, but the type is the same. Here's where it varies from a dual gain sensor. Most modern bodies, especially if you're using pro-level bodies or kind of flagships, but even some of the consumer models now have what's called a dual gain sensor. A dual gain sensor works like this. At that base ISO, a lot of available light. The image gets a nice exposure and it's got a lot of highlights. So we say we'll use that low gain. So down here, base ISO, low gain. And we'll start to just increase the amount of it. So we're going to turn the knob. We're going to increase it slowly. But when we start to get less light and the image has more shadows in it, that low gain doesn't work really well. That knob we've been turning, it's not the right knob anymore. So what the camera manufacturers have done is says, we've got a different type of gain. We're not gonna just put more of it. We're actually gonna change the type. So we're gonna put a high gain in here, which is gonna kick in. And the camera manufacturers for each body decide where that is. ISO 400, 500, 640, 800, somewhere in that spectrum. When there's more shadows, they say, let's switch the type of gain. So instead of turning this dial, this volume knob, let's try this one. This one's a little different. It applies the gain differently. It's actually a different type of gain. And that's where that dual gain kicks in. So somewhere in that spectrum, I'm going to show you an example with my Z9 here in just a second. You're going to see that the actual noise, it's not just brighter or different. It looks different. You can actually tell something happened. So again, when the ISO value is low and we're dealing with base ISO, we've got a low gain. So that we start to crank that knob, we turn it up, but then we switch knobs. We use a different knob to control the gain wherever that camera manufacturer tells you that that point is. I've got some charts to show you. I'm going to jump right over to a different screen and I'm going to show you a set of exposures that I captured. Now, let's just start at this first one. This, by the way, is a picture of a picture. This is not a photograph. This is a picture of a picture of my house. I don't care about detail or anything else. The only thing I care about is getting an image that's got a lot of shadows in it. So we got a dark eye and the throat's dark on this. What I did is I shot it at ISO 800. So this is the exposure at ISO 800. All of the settings are the same. And if you watched my video on stops of light, you would see that as I decrease the amount of light coming in, images get darker. If I have it, it gets darker by one stop. In this case, I'm not dealing with shutter speed and aperture, I'm dealing with ISO. And the same thing happens with ISO. As I decrease my ISO in half, my image gets darker by one stop. This is at ISO 800. This is one stop darker at ISO 400. This is two stops darker at ISO 200. And this is three stops darker at ISO 100. This is, it's not really based on the Z9, but we'll consider this base ISO. So again, ISO 100, 200, 400, and 800, and I have one more stop in here. I included ISO 500. That's not a full stop, it's a third of a stop difference from 400 to 500. Okay, so that's what it looks like. Then what I did, and I'm gonna switch over to Photoshop here, is I corrected them. So because each one was darker, I brightened it by the appropriate exposure. So I increased it one stop or two stops or three stops. I'll show you what it looks like. This is ISO 800. This is that base image. When I increased, or when I go down to ISO 400, I had to boost it by one stop of exposure. And I did that in Photoshop. So +1 exposure for this. This is ISO 200 +2 exposures. Notice the exposures look the same, but I've increased, in Photoshop, I've increased it, the exposure by 2 stops in this case, and here by 3 stops. Those are different images. Notice the exposures looked almost identical. Now, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna zoom in to the shadows. So I'm gonna get right in here, and I'm gonna get close. When I tell you I'm getting close, I'm getting close. I'm gonna pull up the shadows just a little bit so we could see it, and I am getting really far in here. All right, so I probably zoomed in 1,000%. This is ISO 100 with 3 stops of exposure. So I brightened it 3 stops. Remember, it was dark in the beginning, and that's where the noise comes in. The noise actually comes in when I shoot the image. And now, as I pull up the exposure and balance them out, what you're gonna see is they all kind of look the same. ISO 100, that's ISO 200. You can see a slight change, but the noise pattern, almost identical. ISO 400. So one more stop. I had to pull up the exposure and balance it all out, but the noise level looks the same. This is at ISO 400. Now here's the point. These 3 exposures were all shot at low gain. Remember I told you there's 2 different knobs we're gonna turn for this. This was all turned with the same knob. So all the type of gain is the same, 100, 200, and 400. Watch what happens at 500. Did you see the difference? I'll do it again. 400, 500. Something is different. The actual noise looks different. And I've actually changed 2 things. I've changed the noise. I've also changed the dynamic range a little bit. You're not going to see it here, but 2 things happened. Now, why did that happen? It's because I switched the knobs. I'm no longer dealing with the low gain knob. Now I started to deal with the high gain knob. And when I go up to 800, I'm still going to be using the high gain knob. All I'm going to do is increase the amount, boost the gain, but it's the type of gain that changed. So at 100 to 400, I had one type of gain, low gain. At 500 on, all the way up, I dealt with high gain. By the way, a camera manufacturer could put a third, and I believe there is a couple bodies out there that use three. So instead of a dual gain sensor, you've got three gain stops. Three stops at which the type of gain changes. So if you're up at, let's say, ISO 6400, they apply a different type of gain again. Now that hopefully makes sense. So I'll show it to you one more way. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. And I'm going to put a filter on here. Don't worry about this filter. This filter just exaggerates everything. It exaggerates noise and color. So it could look a little different. And what I'm going to do, let me go back here. I'm going to show you, I'm going to do this progression again, and I'm going to show you the change. All right, so 100, you're going to see some, this is a hypersensitive filter, so you're going to see some changes. 200, just take the overall in. Don't get too worried about some of these minor changes. 400, everything's looking similar, not exactly the same, but watch it, 500. You see this shift, like something definitely happened. The gain is different. It's a different type of gain. I switched from the low gain to the high gain, and there you see it, 400 to 500. 400, so remember, 1, 2, 4, they were all similar because it was all the same type of gain. I tried to balance this out as best I could, and I hope that illustration works. Now, I think I'm getting through here. I think this is starting to make sense, right? Two different knobs for two different types of light coming in. When we've got plenty of light and we've got a lot of highlights in the image, we'll deal with low gain. When we get more shadows in the image, we'll deal with high gain, and we'll use we'll turn the knob differently. Now let me pull up a graph. I'm a visual learner, and graphs make sense to me. So hopefully this helped, but let me show you on a graph. This is from a site, by the way, called Photons to Photos, and they just take data from camera bodies and lenses, and they plot it out. So it's easy to understand and easy to read. Some of this can be a little bit detailed. There's a lot of information. Again, 6th grade math teacher, not the college physics professor. So what the 6th grade math teacher wants you to know is, all I care about is the straight line here. This is an indication of ISO and its relationship to noise. There are other factors in here, but I'm just going to keep this simple. This chart, by the way, is called read noise. And I want you to notice this straight line. This is a single gain sensor. This is the D800. Very good sensor, by the way. Single gain sensor. The sensor I just showed you was the Z9. Now look what happened. Remember when I was showing you the images, you saw something changed from 4 to 500. And you see it right here in the graph. ISO 100, 200, and it goes up to 400, and then it drops straight down, and the performance actually starts to get better again. So it got worse up to 400, then it started to get better again. Notice compared to the D800. The D800 was better, in this case, being lower on the graph is better. The D800 was better than the Z9 up into ISO 400. But at ISO 500, the Z9 outperforms the 800. And it's because it has those two different knobs, and it's going to switch the way it does it. It's going to switch over to that high gain, and it's going to use that, and then it's going to continue to increase. So you can see, as it increases, it starts to deteriorate again. Let's look at dynamic range, because I did a series on dynamic range, and I talked about this, and I showed this example. With dynamic range, you lose stops of light as you increase ISO. This is that D800 again, a great sensor. It's got over 11 stops of dynamic range at its base ISO. So at ISO 1, it might be 64, 100, whatever it is, it's got over 11 stops. And then it decreases, and it does so in a linear fashion. And why? It's only got one knob. It doesn't have that second gain, that second type of gain applied to it. When I go over to my trusty Z9, notice what happens. I started with less dynamic range. In this case, being high on the chart, being up top is better. The D800 outperformed the Z9 in terms of dynamic range at its base ISO. But at 500, and you can see it there, it clicks in right there, it evens out. Now it's just as good as the D800 in theory in terms of dynamic range. That's it. Like, that's what a dual gain sensor is. It is simply two different, not just more gain, two different types of gain applied at a very specific point on a camera's sensor. Now, how does that matter to you? Well, here's what's very important. For a camera, more light is better. That's just a fact of life. With more light, you get less noise and you get more dynamic range. That is a fact. However, as somebody who shoots in low light, I value the quantity of light over the quantity of light. If you're a technical shooter, you may think I just need more light because my camera performs better. I know the dynamic range is better and I know I have less noise. Therefore, I'm going to shoot in more available light. Aesthetically, to me, doesn't look as good. So as a wildlife photographer, I am often shooting at higher ISO. So I may be at 400, 600, 800 all the time. I'm almost never below 400. Where it matters might be this. If I know I shoot a lot at ISO 400, but my performance might get better at ISO 500, does it make sense? Like, does it make sense for me to kind of default to ISO 500 or even set parameters on my camera that it can only go down so far? Or instead of using auto ISO, do I just kind of lock in ISO 500 and that's my shooting? Like, I just lock it in because that's the sweet spot of my camera sensor. So there could be some value in that. Here's what I'm going to tell you real life. We can go through all of these charts. I can explain what a dual gain sensor is. My fear is, as we become more aware technically, we often sacrifice some of our artistic choices. And what I mean by this is that sometimes our brains can get so hyper-focused on things, settings, gear, camera, and we lose sight of, for me as a wildlife photographer, what might matter more: quality of light, subjects, behavior, environment. So it is totally up to you how you deal with this information. I have gone to knowing that sweet spot. I have been in some situations where I'm like, you know, I'm just going to lock in my ISO at 500. The lighting, I don't need auto ISO. This scene isn't highly variable. And if I'm at 500, by the way, there's another concept called ISO invariance. If I lock it in at 500, even if it's a little underexposed, I'll just pull it up in post-processing. No, I don't pay any noise penalty. I just make it a little bit brighter in Photoshop or whatever camera processing that you use, whatever editing software, and you pay no noise penalty. So I know some things about my camera, and this is where it becomes a little helpful. I know the sweet spot of my camera, that sensor above the base ISO. I know it's 500. I know it's ISO invariant. If I shoot at ISO 500 for everything, maybe that's what I do. However, you just got to be very careful that you don't become too locked into these metrics and these numbers and these charts that you forget what photography really is. And it's often an art form. It's not always documentation. That's up to you as a photographer. Everybody's different. There are documentation photographers out there. There are technical photographers out there. There are people that just covet the sharpest, most detailed image. That is up to you. You got to know your goals. But the more you know doesn't always hurt you unless you hyper-focus on it and you lose your perspective. So that's what I've got for you today. This was a little quick thought at the end. I'm sorry, I was trying to make this a photo basics video today, but maybe I put a little bit of my bias in there at the end, and that's the fact that sometimes we do have to remember, if we consider ourselves artists or if we want to be artistic, don't get too locked into the technical information. At the end of the day, does this stuff matter? I showed you. It's different, makes a difference. Is it going to make or break a photo? Probably not. These differences are fairly subtle in the big picture, and you just kind of need to know what you're doing as a photographer, the type of style that you shoot, and what you want to do with this information. I hope it made sense, though. I got to believe, down in the comments, you let me know. I got to believe that the charts and those images, that they made sense. I got to believe that they did. So you let me know down in the comments if I did a good job with this one. As your 6th grade math teacher, did I achieve that? And maybe look at your camera. You go into photos, photons to photos, or you research your camera, dual gain, you Google it, it'll come up, it'll tell you right away if it is or if it isn't a dual gain sensor and where that magic spot is. I told you I've been testing the Z6 III, so I'm going to explore this topic of its dual gain sensor when I get to that full review. So stay tuned for that. And again, just make sure you're subscribed to the channel. So many playlists down there. Quick thoughts, product reviews. You don't have to be a wildlife photographer. You can search those playlists for product reviews, for any photographer, or some of these photo basic videos. I hope they're helpful for you. So that's all I got for you today. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.